Hi everyone, welcome back to Coding with Mick. In this video, I wanted to see what it would take to create a GameMaker Studio game, or I shouldn't say create, but take a GameMaker Studio game and port it into Godot. So right now we have this little dinosaur. He has a idle animation, jump and fall, he can walk and then he can run, and he collides with the level. So we're gonna figure out what it's gonna take to make this work in Godot and kind of transfer some of the GameMaker knowledge into Godot. So let's actually switch over to Godot, where I have a blank project here. I'm just going to start doing some little bit of tidying up here where I want my sprites and everything to go into certain folders. So I'm going to right click and make a new folder and call one assets. I'm going to right click and make another one and call one sprites. So to get the sprites actually in Godot, it's very easy. All we have to do is locate where we downloaded the sprites. And I can see that I have my dinosaurs here and my wall, so I'll choose a random dinosaur sprite sheet and my wall. I'm going to copy this just using Control-C, switch back over to Godot, right click on my sprites and say open in file manager. I'm just going to paste them in. And now when I switch back to Godot, we'll have a little flash there, but it's basically re-imported the assets. If for some reason your sprites are a little bit wonky, like they're not super clear, you can come into the import settings as long as you've selected the sprite, and you can kind of change the mode that it is being compressed at. For now, I'll just keep mine as is. Now, what we want to do is start building up some of our objects. Now, the way that Godot works is we have scenes, and within these scenes we have nodes, which are technically our objects, but in Godot we are given a skeleton and then we have to add the different parts. Where in GameMaker Studio, once we create the object, we already have everything we need to do something like draw the sprite or collision code if we code it. So it's a little bit different that way. For example, if we're building our wall, let's create a 2D scene here. And the 2D scene gives us access basically just to the transform and whether or not we can see it and alpha and stuff like that. But what we want to do is we want to show a sprite. So what we have to do is once we're on the node 2D, come up here and add a child node, and let's look up the word sprite because we know that we want to add a sprite to this. So now we can come into the sprite and we can click on the texture. We could say load, or we could just find the wall texture, drag and drop it in, and now we have a sprite in front of us. So the next thing we want to do is our collisions. So let's go back up into node 2D and click on the child node, and let's type in the word body, and you can see that we have three different types. We have a kinematic body, which is used for characters, a rigid body, which is your physics simulation, and then a static body. We are going to be using a static body because our wall isn't going to be moving, so we'll hit create, and that's going to add the component onto this one. So we have a little warning here saying that we don't have a collision shape, and think of collision shapes as your masks in GameMaker Studio. So with the static body 2D selected, let's click the plus button, we'll type in the word collision, and let's use a collision shape 2D. We'll come over here because this error is saying that we don't have a shape. If we sign the rectangle, you can see that we now have a blue icon here, a blue rectangle. So this is our image mask, and what I want to do using my snapping tools is just drag it out to the same size as my sprite. So this is all of we need in the skeleton. Let's rename this to wall and just save it into the root. And let's start working on the actual player. So once again, we'll create a new scene. Instead of using a 2D scene, I'm going to click other node because the only thing I really want the top node to be is going to be that kinematic body. Now the reason I'm using this also is because the kinematic body will give us functions and methods that we are going to be able to use to test a collision itself. So let's just hit create, and now we have to build the skeleton back out. So the first thing we want to do is add the sprite. However, in this case, we want our sprite to be animated. So let's use the animated sprite component. And in here, now we have another warning saying that there's no frames on this animated sprite. So we'll come over to the frames, click on new sprite frames, and if we click on this guy, the bottom is going to open up into the sprite frames tool. So in here, this is where we actually create our animation. So we have a one by default. I'm going to double click and name it idle. I'm going to create a couple more because we do have another one called walk. Then we have one called run, a jump, and then we have a fall animation. So to get our dinosaur sprite sheet in here, let's click on idle and click the little 4 icons here. So if we locate wherever our assets are, and then we go into sprites, we'll click on the dinosaur sprite sheet. This is what we'll end up with. This is the same as converting a sprite sheet into images in GameMaker Studio. We have to say how many vertical or vertical rows do we have in the sprite sheet? We only have one. And then how many horizontal rows? Well, if you count the dinosaurs, we have 24. Now we have to say, okay, which one of these are we going to use for the idle animation? So I'm going to use these 4 here, and then I can move on to the next one. So for the walk, I'll do the same. Keep it as the same sprite sheet. And for the walk, I think it starts 1, 2, 3, 4. It starts there, and then holding my shift key, I'm going to go to over there. So add 6 frames. The jump, let's do the same thing. So the jump will be 2 frames here. The idle, the fall, I think I'm missing one here. The fall is going to be that one. And the run, yes, let's do the run. So the run is the last frames here. So with all of these done, we now have animations in here. So what I can do is I can click on the animated sprite, and I could say, yes, it's currently playing. And if I click on, let's say, the run, you can see that he is now running. So to get the collision actually working, once again, we're going to have to add that collision shape or the mask. So we'll come in here and type in collision shape. Let's choose the shape. We'll just use a rectangle again. Now the one thing to keep in mind is that this particular shape is not really, it's not that nice on the grid. You can see his feet are going down. So I'm gonna deselect snapping and just drag it down a little bit. I think that's pretty good. Okay, so we have everything that we need. So let's go ahead and rename this guy to player. We'll save it, and let's add a script. So we're going to click this little plus script button here, and here you could put it in a script folder. I'm going to leave it where it is. And then the one thing to pay attention to is what you are inheriting. We are inheriting the kinematic body 2D because that's what this guy was when we clicked that button. Now there are different languages in here. There's GD script, there's C#, or you can do C++. I'm just going to keep mine as GD script and click create. In GameMaker Studio 2, when we're declaring variables, we would do something like speed equals 100, gravity equals 30, and then these variables we could use throughout that object. In Godot, we actually have to specify which ones are variables with the word var. Now, because we're doing it at the top and not within a function, we can use it throughout our script. So the other thing we wanted to do is if we wanted to have some variable definitions, we could export these variables. So if I export speed and I click on my player, you can see I have the speed here that I can change. And even though my script doesn't change, it would use the value found over here. So I could actually export the gravity as well, and you can see it goes there. So let's do one more. Let's export a variable called jump_height, and let's set this one to 400. So now we have 3 different variables that we can play around with, and this is really the only 3 that we need to control our character. In GameMaker Studio, we normally use horizontal and vertical movement or speed. In Godot, we have access to a vector 2, and that's just basically a component that has an X and Y coordinate. It just kind of simplifies everything. You could use a struct in GameMaker Studio 2, but just really haven't seen that in too many tutorials. But what we're going to do is we are going to use a velocity variable, and we are going to set that to a vector2.0, which would be setting the X and Y component to 0. Now for functions, this ready function is like the create event. We actually don't need it, so I'm going to hit delete. However, we do need the process event, and this is kind of like your step event. I'll uncomment pass just to get rid of the error. Pass just basically says run this next line and carry on. Before we actually do any of the coding though, we need to set up the input map, and that's going to be our keyboard. So if you are coming from GameMaker Studio 2, if you use the plugin input by Juju Adams, it's kind of the same idea. In Godot, you set up these events or these actions, and then you assign different keys for listening. For example, if we go up to the project settings and we go to input map here, we can add a few different actions. So let's add an action for left, an action for right, one for jump, and then one for run. So you can see they're all down here at the bottom, and if I click the plus button, I can assign a key for left. So I could say use the A key, but also at the same time listen for the left arrow. I could also do mouse buttons, joypads, joy access, and stuff like that. So you can see if my user was pressing the left arrow key and we were listening for this key left action, then we can move our character left, and also if they were using the A key. So let's just go ahead and assign a single key to each one of these. You can assign multiple, but I'm just going to do one key for each except for that first one. So now that we have the input map done, we have to actually use these actions in order to do something. For example, in our step event or process, what we want to do is we want to listen to see if we're pressing any of those keys. So we could say if the input dot is action press, which would be the same as a keyboard check, but we're returning true or false. So we could say if the action press is left, then take our velocity.x and make it minus the speed value. So that would move us to left. I'm going to copy this and say else if our action is going to be key underscore right, then we will have the positive value. And then finally, we'll just say else if nothing is being pressed, then our x value is going to equal 0. Now, before we actually do anything, we have to use a function called move and slide. Move and slide will take where we are going, it will do the collision checks, and then return the remainder. So we'll take our velocity to say equal move and slide, and then the velocity there where we're going to, and then it needs to know the up direction, so how to treat walls and floors. So this is a simple 2D game, so we'll just use vector2.up. So with this little bit of code here, if I hit F6, because I'm on my player, it will run this scene. I know my dinosaur is going to be in the top left, but if I hit the D key, he's moving to the right, the A key to the left if not, and then if I use my arrow, he's also going to move to the left. So we have a whole bunch of different actions being thrown there. So the other thing I want to do is start fixing this up. Let's go to the 2D view again, and I'm going to zoom out, and basically this pink line, green line, and these purplish blue lines, that's what our camera sees. So for now, I'm going to drag my player kind of in the middle just so we can see how things are looking. So back in the script, let's start doing a few things. Let's actually work on the run. So let's declare a local variable called temp speed, and we'll just say it equals speed. And then what we want to do is we want to say if the input dot is action, and we could say is action pressed. Let's see if they press the run key. If they press the run key, let's set our temp speed to be speed times 2. And then we can change this to speed. So therefore, if we're holding down the shift button, our velocity will move double speed. So if I'm pressing left and right, he's going nice and easy. And then I hold my shift key, you can see that he is now running. Now, in GameMaker Studio, we have access to the image X and Y scale, and that's technically how we flip things. And that's what we need to do is we need to access the animated sprite in order to flip things. And it's pretty easy to do. We don't have to do anything like an instance find. But what we could do is type in a facing direction comment here, and we could say if the velocity.x is bigger than 0, then we need to access the animated sprite, so we can do $, and now we have access to everything within our player. We want to access the animated sprite, and particularly we want the scale and the X scale. So if we're moving to the right, we'll set the X scale to 1. And we can say else if the velocity.x is less than 0, which means that we are moving to the left, we'll set the scale to -1. So we can hit F6 because we're on the player, and you can see if I hold the right key, it goes to the right. If I press the left key, he there goes to the left. So before finishing this off with animation and gravity, I'm actually going to go back to the 2D view, click on my player, go to transform and reset so he's at the top left. I'm going to create a new scene, and this is going to be our actual level. So I'll create a new 2D scene, and I'm going to click up here, and this is going to give us the ability to instantiate one of the objects that we've already created. So I'm going to create not a wall, let's actually add our player first. We'll add our player, we'll drag them down here, and back on node 2D, we'll add another node 2D, which will act as a group. And then within this node 2D, we will add our wall, and then we can drag this down. I'll zoom in, turn on snapping, just so we have something a little bit better here. So I'll duplicate the walls here a couple times. Let's go over to this side. Okay. And I'll save this as level. So now we can work on getting our player to be affected by gravity. I'm actually going to put one up here and over here as well. Okay, so back in the script, what we want to do is have the effect of gravity here. So down here, before we actually do our moving, let's do our velocity and dot y is going to be plus equal our gravity. So just like in GameMaker Studio, we're going to add gravity every single frame. Now the really nice part about this is if I hit F6, it's going to run the level tab that I have open here, and automatically the dinosaur is going to be affected by the collisions. And that's because we already set them up. So you can see I can't really do anything because we're colliding with the wall. So now it's just really up to us to finish the rest of the animations and the jumping. So let's actually work on the jumping first. And what I want to do is I want to write a helper function that is going to help us test to see if we're on the ground. So at the very bottom, I'll write a new word for function and I'll say is on ground. And this is going to basically just return whatever value we get from a function called test move. Test move is going to take our current position and then it's going to check where we are moving to and then return true or false whether or not we collide with a collision mask. So we need to test from our current transform, and then where we are moving to is going to be our velocity, or sorry, we need to and where we are moving to would be the vector2 dot down. So we want to check 1 pixel below us to test whether or not we are on the ground. Now with this little bit of code, we can come up and under our velocity x inputs, we could say if the input dot is action just pressed, we could say if they just press the jump key, and if we are on the ground, then our velocity dot y is going to minus equal whatever our jump height is. So if I hit F6 and because we're on the level, I should be able to hit my spacebar and we have jumping. So that is all done. The next thing to do is going to be our animations. So let's do that right before we actually add the gravity. So we'll come in here, add a little comment called animations, and we basically just have to write some logic. So the logic is going to be pretty simple. We're going to say if the absolute value of the velocity x is bigger than 0, then we know that we're currently moving. So let's test to see if we are running or walking. So we could say if the absolute value of velocity.x, if it is bigger than speed, then we know that we are running. So let's access the animated sprite here. So we'll access the animated sprite and we'll say play. And what do we want to play? We want to play the run event. Otherwise, we'll access the animated sprite again and let's play the walk event. So this will be our running and walking, and we'll come back and we'll say if our velocity x does not equal 0, which means that we are standing still, then we can say if is on ground. So if we are standing on the ground, then we want to play our idle animation. If we are not standing on the ground, let's check our velocity y. And if our velocity y is less than 0, then we can say that we are currently jumping. And we could say else, and then we could say else because we'll have a velocity bigger than 0, then we are falling. So let's see here, clean up the code a little bit. I think this looks pretty good. So we'll go back on the level tab, we'll hit F6. Let's see if our animations are working. So we have idle, we have walking, we have running, we have jumping and falling. Perfect. So our dinosaur is working. The only real thing we should do here is kind of build out a quick level. We'll use the tools that we have here. We'll duplicate a whole bunch of things. I don't know why I took that one, but sure, good enough. And I'll duplicate again. And then what I want to do is come up here and I want to add a camera and use a camera 2D. And if I zoom out, you can see this little pink box is our camera. I'll make sure that it is the current one. And I'm going to zoom in. You can see our box is getting a lot smaller here. I'm going to zoom in and kind of just put it in our level. So if I hit F6 on this level, you can see that our dinosaur is walking, he's running, collides with the walls, can jump up and down, and yeah, that's it. That's all it would really take to get this working. Now, as a bonus, let's quickly take a look at how we would use a tile map. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually delete this node 2D for the wall, and let's add a tile map on here. So if we add a tile map, all we need to do is set the tile set. So we'll say new tile set. We'll come in here. Let's add a single tile. So we'll go to assets, sprites, and walls. And in here, we'll say new single tile. And what we want is turn on snapping, and we just drag that out, and the collision I think is already done for us. There we go. So that's the collision. So in the tile map, all we have to do is come in here, and I guess we should really set this up properly. For the tile cell, if we come down to cells, our wall is only 32 by 32. There we go. So that's better. So now if I just drag this out, I'm just going to paint a little bit. We didn't really have to set up any of the collision here besides clicking a few buttons. If I hit F6, it automatically collides. How amazing is that? And I didn't really have to do anything. But anyway, hopefully you found this useful, and it's a good introduction to Godot versus GameMaker Studio. Yeah, let me know if you liked it in the comments, leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe.